I just want to welcome everybody here as we get started. This is the third Political Concepts Conference at Brown. As most of you know, the Political Concepts Initiative is a multi-university collaboration which includes scholars from Brown, Columbia, NYU, and the New School. It's sponsored at Brown by the Kogut Center for the Humanities, where it is led by Adi Ophir, who is Mellon Visiting Professor of the Humanities here at the center. And he works in collaboration with two Brown colleagues to organize and lead this initiative. Bonnie Honig, who is miraculously here after convalescing. We're delighted to have her here. Brown is not the same without your presence. Thank you for making the effort and getting here today. And Tim Buse, who we also really, really appreciate all the time. Okay. I also just want to note that Adi Ophir brought the Political Concepts Initiative here to Brown when he started as Mellon Visiting Professor in January of 2013. It had previously been an initiative, and it still is an initiative, at Tel Aviv University, where it started around 2007, 2008, and goes under the name Lexicon for Political Theory. I can't tell you what kind of, how lucky we are, first of all, that Adi is here as an ongoing visiting professor, and that he has brought such an exciting and generative project. I think we all feel strongly that we're really lucky that he's here and that he has brought this here. The Political Concepts Initiative has proven to be a generative and frame-shifting way of doing political theory across a range of disciplines and within a plurality of practical commitments. As you can see at a glance from the program, the project aims to revise key concepts in contemporary political discourse and to introduce new concepts for understanding a rapidly changing global and political reality. It has an associated peer-reviewed journal, politicalconcepts.org, where the papers delivered at the conferences are posted, and I invite you to take a look at that website. It's really interesting. By remaining open to what might count as a political concept and how its meaning, relevance, energies, and effects might be described and practiced, the Political Concepts Project remains an engaged and adaptive model of scholarly endeavor. At Brown and elsewhere, it's drawing in scholars from across the humanities and the social sciences, which is another one of its great virtues. So I want to just, thank Adi, Tim, and Bonnie for the work they've done, not only in setting up this conference, but in generating sustained forms of intellectual conversation and programming around this important project, including an ongoing reading group. I think it's especially valuable to have the opportunity to hear our Brown colleagues in conversation with one another, though we also have visitors from outside of Brown. But there are many institutions where this pretty much never happens. You never hear your colleagues speak unless you go somewhere else, like to a national conference, and then you go, oh, that's what you're like. Anyway, I'm thrilled that this sort of event is taking place here at the Kogut Center. I should also announce that last year, largely because of the initiative and energy of the three organizers, Brown became a formal partner of the initiative, and we'll be hosting a large conference next December, which will feature thinking and conversation with the work of Etienne Balibar, who is here with us for this conference as well, but not here? I thought he was coming. He thought he was coming too? Okay, all right, well, okay. We should get started with the first panel now. So I'm very pleased to be moderating the first panel, and we're just going to do really brief introductions. Sharon Krause will speak first. She is Professor of Political Science here at Brown. She's the author of Liberalism with Honor, 2002, Civil Passions, Moral Sentiment, and Democratic Deliberation, 2009, and just this year, Freedom Without Sovereignty, Reconstructing Liberal Individualism. Oh, beyond, sorry. Okay, no, it's really important. You're right. I don't know why, we can think about why that happened. James Schmidt is professor of history, philosophy, and political science at Boston University. He's the author of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Between Phenomenology and Structuralism, and the editor of What is Enlightenment? 18th Century Answers and 20th Century Questions, a text I think we probably all know, and Theodore Adorno, 2007, as well as co-editor with Amélie Rorty of The Critical Guide to Kant's Idea for a Universal History, 2009. I want to thank both panelists for being here, and we'll just get started. I guess we move this around.
Do we need it? Do I do? Okay. Okay, then. And really near, closer, like that. Okay. So my thanks to Amanda and to Adi and Bonnie and Tim for organizing the workshop and for the chance to be a part of it. My concept is political agency, and it's a really good moment for me to be able to talk with you about agency because it's very much a part of the new book project that I'm just at the beginning of, which explores themes of ecology and emancipation. And the further I get into this project, the more it seems to me that we really do need to reimagine the notion of agency and many of our assumptions about it if we're going to be successful in making any kind of progress on the environmental problems we face as they intersect with issues of oppression and exploitation. Okay, so agency as a political concept is really fundamental to the study of politics because it's crucial to the coordinated activity that's constitutive of political life. Agency is especially central in theories of democratic politics because it's a precondition for collective self-rule and political contestation and the pursuit of justice. The concept of agency also allows us to distinguish sources of activity that are subject to moral and political accountability from those that are not. So Hurricane Katrina caused a great deal of misery in New Orleans and had a big impact on politics there, but nobody attributes moral or political responsibility to the hurricane. Accountability only applies to sources of activity that are more than just the causes of outcomes, sources that are also agents. So agents are, if nothing else, sources of activity that can be responsive to notions of what ought to be, to principles of justice and conceptions of the good, to the claims of others, to their own dreams and aspirations. The most common way to conceive agency in both liberal and democratic theory has been to identify it with intentional choice and control over action. So whether that's rooted in a rational will or just a creative one, agency commonly gets equated with the exercise of will and understood as a kind of personal sovereignty. To be an agent from this perspective is to be in control of what you do rather than being controlled by others or by circumstance. It means acting on your own intentional choices rather than acting from instinct or necessity or deference. If most people doubt that human beings ever achieve perfect control in this sense, and I think most people do doubt that human beings ever achieve perfect control, still many of us do assume that the closer you come to that ideal, the more agentic you'll be. It's also common to locate agency inside the individual, especially in the faculty of will. So we hold to what I'm calling a sovereigntist view of agency to the extent that we identify agency, at least in the ideal case, as a capacity for personal control over action, where the content of one's will defines the meaning of the action, and one's effects manifest one's own choices rather than the wishes of others or the random effects of chance. The sovereigntist view of agency is a common one, but it distorts important features of human experience. And it tends to undermine, I think, the quality of our political life. Among other things, when we equate agency with narrowly or strictly with intentional choice and control, we make it difficult to establish accountability for social dynamics to which individuals contribute without intending to do so, and without controlling the outcomes. So this applies to social dynamics like systemic oppression and implicit bias, and the often impersonal exploitation involved in global labor markets. It also applies to outcomes like climate change and other forms of environmental degradation, because in all of these cases, outcomes exceed the control of any particular individual, and they often result from effects that are unintended and even unconscious at the individual level. So if I didn't knowingly set out to discriminate or exploit or pollute, we think, and if I didn't have control over these outcomes, then they must not be a function of my agency, and so they must not be my fault. Maybe it would be nice of me to try to do something about them, but because I'm not actually responsible for them, I don't have any real obligation to change them. Or so the thinking goes. We're right to think that accountability presupposes agency. But if agency is tied strictly to intentionality and control, then there are going to be many pressing political problems for which none of us can be held accountable because they outrun our intentions and elude our control. Our sovereigntist assumptions about agency will therefore tend to exacerbate these problems rather than being a resource for emancipatory and ecologically sustainable political change. To cultivate a more just and sustainable politics, we need to rethink agency in more non-sovereign ways, and so that's the purpose of my paper. And I should say at the outset that I'm focusing really on individual agency, not collective agency, although I'm arguing that individual agency has a necessarily intersubjective character. But I'm leaving aside for now the discussion of collective agency per se. And I'm going to talk first about what it means to say that individual agency is a non-sovereign phenomenon. And there I'm going to talk both about the ways that it's socially distributed and also about the ways that it's materially or corporeally distributed. And then I'll say something briefly about the accountability dimension of non-sovereign agency and its role in sustainable and emancipatory politics. And I won't go beyond 30 minutes. So first, agency as a non-sovereign experience. To be an agent is to have an impact on the world that you can recognize as being in some sense your own. Agency, therefore, has two sides to it, an identity side and an efficacy side. The identity side, which involves a sense of self, makes it possible for us to recognize ourselves in our initiatives and effects, to experience a particular outcome or impact as something that we in particular have done. Without a sense of self, there's no possibility for me to find myself in my deeds and no chance to identify with my effects. Everything I do then will feel to me like an event that happens to me rather than an action that's carried out by me. So that's why personal identity or a sense of self matters for agency. The efficacy side of agency, for its part, distinguishes agency from mere willing or dreaming. Agency involves real action and impact on the world. You're not an agent if you're not a source of actual activity. Once we acknowledge the efficacy side of agency and recognize the distinction between agency and mere willing, we have to admit, I think, that agency is not an exclusively internal property of the person. The reason agency isn't exclusively internal is that how our initiatives affect the world often depends on how other people and the material world itself respond to our initiatives. Individual agency, in this sense, is socially and materially distributed. The distributed nature of agency disrupts the familiar association between agency and control because the social and material exchanges that help constitute agency are not fully subject to the agent's control. Agency also regularly comes apart from our choices and intentions because we're commonly the sources of outcomes that we didn't foresee or wish to bring about. For both of these reasons, because agency eludes personal control and because it extends beyond intentional choice, for both those reasons, the exercise of agency is a non-sovereign experience, to use language introduced by Hannah Arendt. Individual agency, in other words, is a dynamic, interactive phenomenon with sources that include but are not limited to the individual subject. It's an emergent property of intersubjective and intercorporeal exchanges, not solely a function of faculties like the will that are strictly internal to a particular person. Okay, so now I'm going to explain that. Starting with Arendt and the social distribution of agency. So as Arendt puts it in The Human Condition, there are two parts to any action: the beginning made by a single person, and the achievement in which many people join by bearing and finishing the enterprise, by seeing it through. Action's first moment involves individual initiative, the effort to begin something new, to make something happen, an effort that discloses the distinctive identity of the individual agent. But in the public sphere, as Arendt puts it, action is never possible in isolation, but needs the presence of others to be effective. Other people are needed as co-actors who participate with the agent in the actual achievement of her enterprises or objective. So just as a leader's initiatives depend for their success on the support of her followers, so the enterprises of any individual regularly require a community of bearers, in Arendt's sense, to help bring them to fruition. To act in social and political life is to insert ourselves into a reverberating web of human responses and effects. The beliefs and values and intentions of other people affect how we affect the world. They help shape the unfolding narrative of enterprises and outcomes that constitutes the story of what we've done. Agency emerges from, then, this kind of constellation of communicative exchanges and background meanings and social interpretations and personal intentions and self-understandings through which one's identity comes to be manifest in one's deeds. One implication of non-sovereignty is that one's effects can affirm one's identity without necessarily bringing to fruition the specific intentions that motivated the action. In other words, our effects can outrun or even counteract our intentions without thereby eradicating our agency. And Greek tragedy dramatizes this dynamic. Oedipus in no way intended to do the dreadful deeds that later brought him so much misery. But still, the reason for his misery is precisely that they were his deeds, despite the fact that they were, in an important way, unintended. We might also think of the ways that we unwittingly perpetuate norms of racism and sexism. A woman's excessive deference in the company of male colleagues, a white teacher's heightened scrutiny of his black students. Clearly, we can be agents of racism and sexism even when we don't set out to discriminate, in part because of how our initiatives interact with the social meanings and relations of power onto which they fall. The reason we can recognize unwitting racists and relate to tragic heroes like Oedipus is that we know, as Bernard Williams once said, that in the story of one's life, there's an authority that's exercised by what one has done, and not merely by what one has intentionally done. In this sense, the non-sovereignty of agency makes agency more potent than we often realize, or potent in ways that we're not accustomed to acknowledge. Agency's non-sovereignty also makes it vulnerable in ways we don't always see. A background of systematic social inequality, for instance, can distort the social interpretation of identities and actions in ways that undercut the community of bearers that are needed to bring an action to fruition, disabling social uptake and causing pervasive failures of agency for those who are marginalized. Consider this passage from James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son. To be a Negro, Baldwin writes, meant that one was never looked at, but was simply at the mercy of the reflexes that the color of one's skin caused in other people. Where the meaning of one's action is interpreted, in other words, through the lens of racial stigma and stereotype, other people are going to understand what you're doing with reference to what they expect of your type, instead of in terms that are receptive to your distinctive individuality and your own understanding of the action. Baldwin consequently finds that he's doing things that he never intended and that he can neither understand nor identify with. I simply did not know what was happening, he writes at one point. I did not know what I had done. His actions are being read by others as hostile and aggressive or crazy even, when for him, they simply reflect his personal sense of dignity and his ambition, which is something that, against the background of racial stigma and stereotype, couldn't make sense to others. In a similar way, a woman who thinks she's conveying her opinion in a direct, straightforward manner to her colleagues at work, but who gets interpreted by them as antagonistic or bitchy because her manner fails to comport with our norms of feminine deference, experiences a similar kind of failure of agency, or at least her agency is troubled in a deep way, because her actual effects contravene her identity and initiative. Experiences like this one are common among the marginalized and the subordinate. They involve subtle dynamics of social uptake and non-uptake that powerfully affect individual agency in ways that are informal, often invisible, and very difficult to articulate. These are among, I think, the dynamics that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to help us see and deal with. And the pushback that the movement is getting on college campuses now is, at least I think in part, a function of how much we misunderstand the basic nature of human agency. So the non-sovereign approach helps us see that agency is both more potent and also more vulnerable than we often think. The non-sovereignty of agency also refers to the fact that agency is corporeally distributed because it depends on how one's initiatives interact with the activities of other material entities. Most of the time, what we conventionally think of as individual agency actually reflects what Jane Bennett calls an assemblage of material actants that includes more than the individual alone. And the assemblages that constitute agency encompass more than just human beings. Though we often think of the material world as inert, as a kind of passive receptacle for our agentic projections, the reality is more complex. Matter has its own vitality, as Bennett puts it, and matter is the source of activities that interact with and help constitute the deeds of agents. In one sense, the materially distributed character of agency is obvious. So when I speak to you, the formation of sound that I generate through my vocal cords and my breath and my lips, this can only have an impact on you because of the vibration of molecules in media, liquids, solids, and gases, through which the sound waves that I generate move. Without the movement of molecules through media, my agency in this instance couldn't come to fruition. When I sit down to eat breakfast, the chair at the kitchen table holds me up while gravity holds me down. The verb holds expresses something real here, which is that there are physical forces doing things in and around us all the time, things that interact with our initiatives in ways that can either obstruct them or support them. Matter is not inert, but full of activity, as any physicist or chemist will tell you, and its activities interact with our initiatives to constitute our agency in ways that we don't fully understand or control. We tend to be oblivious to matter's role in constituting agency, in part because we're so focused on the aspects of agency that do happen inside us, the willing, the thinking, the desiring, and so on. But in part, too, as adults, we've had extensive experience in learning how to act in ways that are upheld rather than undercut by the material world. We've adapted our initiatives to the distinctive vitalities of the matter we regularly encounter. And the material fields in which agency emerges are relatively stable and predictable, so that once we've adapted to them, we interact with them in ways that support our agency with a fair amount of consistency. And that consistency then makes the role of material forces in constituting agency recede from our view. It allows us to feel far more sovereign than we actually are. There are three implications of all this that I want to flag or highlight. The first is that the individual agent is not a closed or static object. Agency is characterized by a kind of porosity that makes each agent, as David Abrams has said, like an open circuit that completes itself only in things, in others, in the surrounding earth. Understanding this material circuitry of agency disrupts fundamental assumptions that we make about the boundedness of agents. Agents do need to be individuated in order to be subject to accountability, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But they're not fixed, self-contained units in the ways that we have often tended to assume. The second implication is to explode the illusion of agency as material mastery. It's true that agents regularly shape features of the material world in ways that conform to their wills, but that's a far cry from mastery, as our endless unintended effects remind us. And even when we're successful in shaping some part of the material world, we're able to do that only because of how the world responds to our initiatives, as matter's own vitalities circulate through us and link us to a wider field of material bearers that can complete the circuit of our agency and bring our actions to fruition. The third implication is to undermine the strict divide between human beings and the rest of nature. In this respect, the non-sovereign approach to agency connects up with recent work in posthumanist and ecology studies, which are also contesting that divide. If agency is an intercorporeal phenomenon that emerges through circuits of vitality that include non-human aspects of the material environment, which are themselves sources of activity, then human agents can hardly claim to stand apart from and above this environment. Human beings do have some distinctive capacities that aren't shared by most other material entities. And this distinctiveness is significant because it makes us subject to ethical and political accountability in special ways. But to acknowledge this distinctiveness is not the same as insisting on a binary and hierarchical divide between human beings and everything else on Earth. We depend on the Earth, and we depend on it to provide more than just a field of opportunity for the projection of our agency. We depend on it as a vital contributing source in the constitution of our agency. It's part of the very capacity that ostensibly distinguishes us. The vitality of the material world and the open circuitry of agency are sometimes thought to imply that everything in the world is agentic. Bennett's work points in this direction. She acknowledges agency-relevant differences between different ontological forms, but she does attribute agency very widely. As she sees it, there are various sources or sites of agency, including the intentionality of a human animal, the temperament of a brain's chemistry, the momentum of a social movement, the mood of an architectural form, the propensity of a family, the style of a corporation, the drive of a sound field, and the decisions of molecules at far from equilibrium states. Dismantling, as she's trying to do, the hierarchical divide between human beings and the rest of the material world is, I think, one of the most important ethical and political challenges of our time. A just and sustainable democratic politics depends on that, and so does the future of the human and many other species. But still, there are good reasons to distinguish agency from material vitality or activity per se. There's something distinctive about a source of activity that can respond to normative injunctions. Respect my rights, be kinder, make the world better. Something distinctive about a source of activity that can respond to injunctions like that and that understands itself as accountable for its activity in this way. To acknowledge this distinctiveness is not necessarily to limit agency to human beings. Research on non-human animals is increasingly showing norm sensitivity and self-awareness in a range of beings beyond the human. Agency as a source of accountable activity exists on a continuum, and many beings exercise agency in one degree or another. But not all material entities that manifest vitality are also capable of agency, and the distinction is worth preserving, partly for descriptive reasons because it captures something real about the world, and partly because as a normative matter, being able to distinguish accountable from non-accountable sources of activity is important for creating a just and sustainable political life. But once we understand the ways that agency is non-sovereign, acknowledging its distinctiveness no longer carries the kind of baggage it once did in terms of attributing mastery and moral superiority to human beings. A non-sovereign account of agency does not set the human apart from and above the rest of nature. It won't sustain the illusion of human control over nature, and it doesn't invite human beings to instrumentalize nature for our own purposes. On the contrary, a non-sovereign approach gives us reason for humility and gratitude and respect toward nature. In fact, it achieves just the kind of reorientation toward nature that I think Bennett is seeking, but without ascribing agency to everything under the sun. Ironically, the effort to elevate the status of nature by attributing agency to it recapitulates the old false assumption that agency is the sole basis for ethical value and moral standing and political significance. We should be able to acknowledge the value of nature without attributing agency to it. We should stop thinking that the only way to count morally and politically is by being an agent. Still, to insist, as I mean to do, that agency involves a reflexive sense of self and norm responsiveness, that may seem itself to reproduce core elements of the sovereigntist approach. But the reflexive and responsive self of non-sovereign agency is not equivalent to rational autonomy, traditionally conceived. It involves embodied capacities in which cognitive and affective modes of consciousness are thoroughly entwined. It's true that reflexive self-awareness is unavailable to beings and objects that lack complex cognitive functions, but it would be wrong to equate self-awareness with a form of cognition that transcends affective bodily experience. Cognition happens in brain matter, after all, and many of our experiences of self-awareness involve physical and emotional sensations. Likewise, much of what constitutes personal identity takes the form of reflective sentiment and the integrated cognitive/affective apparatus of habit. Norm responsiveness, too, is an embodied faculty. As lots of recent work has shown, the sense of right and wrong really is a sense as much as anything else, a sense that involves a mix of both cognition and affect. We feel as much as reason our way to what we ought to do. So the notion of a reflexive, norm-responsive self doesn't have to imply an ideal of personal sovereignty grounded in some imagined faculty of transcendent reason. Still, the capacity to stand in reflective relationship to oneself and to be responsive to normative claims and aspirations is at the heart of the important distinction between an agent and a mere cause. This capacity is what gives agency its accountability. The kinds of accountability that are available to non-sovereign agency will differ somewhat from conventional conceptions of responsibility, though. Conventional accounts of responsibility typically insist on two criteria for the attribution of responsibility. First, intentionality, and second, control. If you didn't intend to do it and you didn't have control over what happened, we don't normally hold you responsible, or at least we hold you responsible only in a mitigated, secondary kind of a way. The control condition, as the second criterion is sometimes called, is widely thought to be, as one theorist puts it, the very essence of moral responsibility in liberal societies. This condition is fundamentally at odds, though, with the non-sovereignty of agency, because agency is never entails or achieves full control, given its socially and materially distributed character, its dependence on uptake and response, its need for bearers. Then, too, the fact that agency regularly outruns and sometimes even contradicts the agent's intentions, that troubles the first criterion of the conventional view, which is intentionality. But as I mentioned at the outset, to have any hope at all of progressive political change, we need to be able to hold agents accountable for their unjust and unsustainable effects, even when these effects weren't consciously intended by them. Though it would be a mistake to blame people for their unintended harms in the same way that we blame them when they intentionally did wrong, still we need to be able to hold them accountable in some way for their unintended contributions to harm, and accountable also for doing things differently in the future. Of course, in light of agency's non-sovereignty, we also need to recognize that asking people to do things differently in the future is often going to require creating new sources of social and material uptake for their agency. And where social inequality disrupts the agency of the oppressed, we'll need to reconstruct those disabling dynamics. Being an agent, in other words, involves responsibility to foster conditions and assemblages that nourish agency, both one's own and that of others. This is a responsibility that we share, and it's a primary function of democratic politics and society and culture. We also share responsibility for learning more about how our initiatives interact with the activities of the material world, acknowledging our own dependence, watching for unintended damage, and being responsive to what a more sensitive attunement to nature may reveal. Non-sovereign accountability will also mean being attentive to the plural communities of accountability in which we find ourselves, with the multiple modes of communication and responsiveness that they entail. So accountability and responsiveness among human beings is going to look different from the kinds of accountability that are possible across species and between human beings and inorganic nature. A lot more work needs to be done to develop the contours of non-sovereign accountability on all these dimensions and to guide us to the kinds of assemblages that can produce more just and sustainable political life. But one of the remarkable things about non-sovereign agency is that it gives us tools for creating the conditions of its own flourishing. Agency is a source of emancipatory possibility in this sense, but it's also a perennial project that demands the continuing effort and initiative and attunement of us all. So agency is not quite what we thought it was, or what many of us have long thought it was. It's not rational autonomy, not mastery or control over action, not simply intentional choice or spontaneous creativity. It's not contained within the individual will, but is a dynamic, distributed phenomenon that arises through intersubjective and intercorporeal exchanges, and that combines affective and cognitive modes of being. Agency is a political concept because how we understand it affects the quality of our political life. And the stakes here are high. Our old ideas about agency are implicated in the enduring injustices and ecological destruction that everywhere haunt us today, often with deadly results. But we can do better. We can free ourselves from the chains of our rapacious past and from a present that is at once exploitative and slavish. The dream of mastery is an illusion, that's true, but the special responsibility that we bear for emancipation is real. Emancipation of human and other creatures, of the world itself. Emancipation is possible, but it requires new ways of conceiving agency and new ways of being human. The emancipation that non-sovereign agency promises is a radical project because of all that it asks us to change. It's a political project because the only way to proceed, effectively at least, is together.
Oh, so we don't,
No, we have both.
we don't get to talk about it? Okay. Yeah. Well, this does have a visual component to it. Yeah, okay. I don't know, is that okay over there?
Yeah, because
Okay.
there's two.
Yeah, oh, I see, yeah, okay. So, in keeping, oh, so, this fall I found myself teaching a course on publicity, which was part of the ever desperate moves which we in the humanities make to try to attract new people. And it struck me that publicity was both a rather central concept in modern political thought, I mean, indeed, maybe even an essential concept, but also had certain other associations, which I thought were, worth exploring. What I wasn't aware when I proposed the course was that the students that showed up for it were mostly those schooled in those other associations. So I found myself teaching Hannah Arendt to massive numbers of people with training in public relations. I think that was a good thing because there is a tendency, I think, of those of us who work all of the time or part of the time in the domain of political theory to be in something that's a bit like, a gated community with rather, good friends there, and you're sort of safe, how to behave in that community. And there are these certain other seedier areas of the academy that are worth investigating from time to time. Partially, this is the advantage of teaching in 3 departments, because I can always tell the people in, like in the political science department that, I don't understand this stuff because I'm a historian. And then when I'm in the history department, I say, well, I really do history of political thought. And I guess that maybe I'm developing a non-sovereign agency, so there's some sort of hope. So if we look at the Oxford English Dictionary, which sometimes is right, we get these, I think, 2 rather interesting definitions of publicity. And I won't bother to read them all out, but I think if you look at these 2, what's going on here is, first of all, a definition that talks about publicity as a property that certain things have, right? I mean, as an attribute that certain entities possess. They have publicity. This is something that inheres in an object. The second definition seems to be about a practice or an activity or something that's done to convey that attribute on objects, right? So it's public notice or attention given to something. I mean, it shifts it, if you will, from the object to the agent. What I didn't put up here was that the first definition that the Oxford English Dictionary lists, it lists as obsolete, which I think is something that may confirm some of the worst fears of what is I think, despite many problems, still the most important text that we have that discusses the notion of publicity. And that's a book that initially appeared in German in the late 1950s, and then much too late was translated into English with the rather, I think, disastrously misleading title, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. Towards the end of that book, there is an untranslatable, well, it's translatable, but the results aren't pretty, a difficult to translate passage in which the author, someone by the name of Jürgen Habermas, that I assume people have heard of at one point or another, he's trying to sum up what he's been doing, what he's been talking about in this entire book. And what was striking to me when I went back and looked at this thing again, because I also had these PR people reading Habermas, which was, I think they found him to make more sense than Arendt, which was interesting. The passage is bouncing back and forth between English and German in the original. And what he's capturing here, that there is, and this might be worth just working through here. Publicitat, I mean, here he's using a word of good Kantian provenance. Once meant the exposure of political domination before the public use of reason. And pulling out public use of reason, of course, is this almost cruel distinction that Kant draws in the essay, What is Enlightenment, between public and private uses of reason, a distinction that seems like it was crafted just to confuse people, because it seems to be just at such variance with our quote-unquote, our normal ways of using the term. But I think it's a quite sensible way of distinguishing between certain uses of reason which we may have that are extra vocational, if you will, such as posting on a Twitter account that you would really like to see Wayne LaPierre's head on a stick. Is a public use of reason. It's not part of what you would do in a classroom, and then versus your private use of reason, which is your reason placed in, subject to a certain other set of conventions and arrangements that you've entered into as part of a post that you may hold. And in the case of being, say, a professor at a university, I assume that means showing up on time for your classes and teaching them, and not at some point when you have a course on publicity that you're teaching that's filled with public relations students, not taking them all out to lunch and saying, well, this relationship isn't working, I think we should start seeing other people. So publicity, and then he goes into English here. He uses the English publicity, now adds up to the reactions of an uncommitted friendly disposition. In the measure that bourgeois publicity, and here I think we need to start translating Öffentlichkeit, not as the translators insist that they're always going to do it, as public sphere, which I think just makes the book make no sense at all. And we can come back to that and discuss it if we like. In the measure that bourgeois publicity is shaped by, then he goes to public relations, right? So now we have English coming in once again and doing something to a German word. It takes on feudal features. The suppliers display a showy pomp before customers ready to follow. Plebiscite imitates the kind of aura proper to personal prestige and supernatural authority once bestowed by representative or representational Öffentlichkeit. So it's really an account of how concepts have changed over time. And as I've tried to argue in various places, I think we really need to read this book as an attempt to try to trace the conceptual history of the notion of publicity, a term which once meant one thing and has now come to mean something very different. And I think what's really essential for anyone trying to make sense of the book is to read Harold Maa's article, a brilliant article, which just explains just how much damage has been done to the reception of Habermas by assuming that this is a book about something called the public sphere, as if it was a space that people entered or were excluded from. I mean, no, it's a book about a fiction, a fictitious identity that briefly has a certain sort of plausibility, but then that begins to change. And as it begins to change, we seem to lurch back into a period where certain forms of publicity that the way in which things became public that had a certain feudal features, then again begin to appear once again. And what the translation, I think, of Öffentlichkeit as public sphere does is remove a lot of the sting from this book. And as Ma points out in I think a really very sharp passage, when you run into a sentence where Habermas is talking about how Öffentlichkeit becomes a sphere, and it becomes located in certain entities like coffee houses or salons or book clubs. When you read that as Öffentlichkeit, but when you read that in English, it's the public sphere presents itself as a sphere. Well, duh. I mean, how could it not be a sphere, right? So much is being lost here. Now, I have to say that the author himself, Habermas, has backed away from some, I think, the most audacious features of this book, and now seems to be content to have the book read as everyone else seems to be reading it. Hence, if we look at how Habermas now talks about the public sphere in some of the more recent works, we get these strange metaphors of the public sphere having sluices that run into it and filters that go out of it. And at that point, my mind starts to hurt, and all I can think of is the public sphere as some sort of a massive sewage treatment plant, which actually may be a pretty good metaphor for it. The word we've lost, I think, and it was pretty clear, at least to W.G. Runciman in 1964, when he was reviewing the German version of the book, is we really need a word in English to translate Öffentlichkeit. And as he noted at the very start of his review, Öffentlichkeit is not readily translatable into English. Publicness does appear in the OED, but is not passed into current usage, and a useful abstract noun has been lost to the English-speaking reader. Publicness has been lost, but we do have a term that we can use to translate Öffentlichkeit, and that term is publicity. The fact that when we translate Öffentlichkeit not as public sphere, but as publicity, we wince at every moment that we do it, is probably a good thing, because at least lets us, be aware perhaps of the violence that has been done to certain sort of concepts. So in what follows, I'd like to try to sketch out what happens if you try to trace the violence that has been done to certain concepts through the transformations in certain words. And Adi and I have talked about how we think about concepts. I suppose I'm much more hooked on the notion of words being things of concepts being things that are described by packages of words, and the packages of words we have begin to shift their meaning in certain ways, and that then causes certain problems with concepts. So it's really nice to be here, because I'm sure that what I'm doing is not how most people do stuff here, but then I'm used to this because I've been teaching PR students all semester, so, and I'll stop talking about that. So within the political field of political theory, the canonical accounts of publicity come mainly from Immanuel Kant and from Jeremy Bentham. On Kant's discussions of publicity, I will probably say nothing here because I don't think there's a lot more that I could say better than what John Christian Larsen wrote in I think really just a brilliant 1986 article in Political Theory, which does a rather nice job of showing how Kant is appropriating a term that has a certain currency in the accounts of print media during his own day, and is using that in a few crucial places as being the basic principles then that we apply to public law. That public law, in order to be binding, has to be something that's public and has to be, and the fact that it's made public also renders it that it has publicity, then also renders it susceptible to criticism by newspapers, by writers, by individuals taking up a role of using their reason publicly and publishing their reason in various print journals of newspapers, and hence the rather close connection between this criteria for public law and an emphatic defense of freedom of the press. And we meet with much the same thing in Jeremy Bentham, a rather famous passage. This, in fact, turns up, the first sentence there turns up in the OED's, one of the OED's example of the obsolete notion of publicity, the very soul of justice. And then it keeps on going as Bentham frequently goes on. It's such a great pleasure to read Bentham. And you can find similar sentiments to this in Bentham's various proposals for a public opinion tribunal, which is going to be somehow watching over everything that is done by legislators. After Kant and Bentham, the canonical account, at least insofar as historians of political thought talk much about the notion of publicity, we'll make brief visits to John Stuart Mill, where the term turns up a few times. And if they're really adventurous, they talk about Henry Sedgwick. But then what basically where these accounts want to go is to get to John Rawls as quickly as possible. And once there, we're sort of on secure ground, and we can then begin to go back to what's essentially a working out of some other version of a Kantian account of the importance of publicity. What that misses actually is certain interesting 19th century texts that have completely fallen out of the canon. One example, which I've only known about for a couple of weeks, which is the advantages of doing talks like this, is Francis Lieber's On Civil Liberty and Self-Government from 1853. Has anyone heard of this text? Because Lieber seems to be a really interesting person. He's a German emigre that comes to the United States, teaches at in the antebellum South. He's teaching at one of the colleges in Carolina. The Carolinas before the secession, he gets out of the South and moves to Columbia, where he holds, I think, one of the first positions in the United States, where he describes himself as a political scientist, and that's how he wants to name his position. In this book on civil liberty and self-government, which, you go into WorldCat, this thing, there are massive numbers of titles of university libraries in the United States that still have this on their shelves or in their depositories. So this must have been a book that had wide circulation. This book has an entire chapter on publicity. He seems to be going through political concepts in this book. So it's sort of perhaps somewhat appropriate to the concerns that we have here. About how publicity is really essential to any government that wishes to preserve certain liberties. Despite and the way in which I found Lieber was by going through the much maligned and indeed, I think, easily malignable toy that Google released on us, now 3 years ago, the Ngram. And if we track what happens to publicity, we see, a rapid, shall we say, acceleration around the beginning of the 20th century. And a bit of a blip there in the 1840s when editions of Bentham are being produced quite rapidly. These are, let me just say, ridiculously small numbers. I'm not one of those people that think the n-gram can be used as much more than sort of like, I think of it as sort of sonar. Like if you're looking for the Loch Ness Monster, you send things down and see if there's anything moving around on the floor. So the n-gram is the way in which I look at large periods of time and text, and then it looks like there's something swimming around down there, and then drop down and try to read certain of these examples. There is, however, a somewhat more elegant tool that we can use to search large text corpus, and that is a bookworm. And bookworm gives us here, this is not what bookworm, but bookworm allows you to search particular text corpora. So what this is, among other things, other tricks that it can do. So this is just preliminary. What if we just confine the search to the HathiTrust corpus? So these are the books that Google has scanned that are now available through the HathiTrust to most of our universities and to the broader public. But what Bookworm is really good at doing is allowing you to split out by either, depending upon how it's been configured, Library of Congress numbers or topic numbers or genre numbers. So if we break it out into looking at what's happening with publicity, the blue line there is books that are in world history or philosophy, psychology, religion, in other words, the B books. Or law and political science. And if we split that out from the complete corpus, we can see that the lines are sort of, we get a little bit of waffling back and forth, where at certain points this particular corpus of texts in law, philosophy, political science are matching what's happening in the general corpus. But then this sort of rapid acceleration seems, at least to my eyes, being driven largely by what's taking place as this term begins to come into use in these last years of the 19th, first years of the 20th centuries. Something is happening with certain people are laying possession to this word, and maybe a conceptual change is taking place as a result of this increased use. We can also break it down into various different types of genres. And here, what I think is striking is that how much is going on in the area of government publications. So we have certain public agencies, are swimming around down there in the murk of history, pumping out the word publicity quite frequently in their documents. Now, an explanation for why this is all going on, or what is going on in the last years of the 20th century, last years of the 19th century, may become obvious even before looking at particular titles, which you can then easily do at this point. And I think what we're beginning to see, and what we're increasingly seeing here, is the way in which the progressive era in American history begins to work itself out in terms of certain demands for the accountability, for the publicity of business dealings, of campaign contributions, of bringing, the OED's second sense of this word, of bringing certain things previously hidden from sight into the light of publicity, where they can be scrutinized and examined and made visible to an electorate that might not otherwise have seen them. I suppose at this point I should mention that I am biologically but not intellectually responsible for Bookworm and for other things. The same one of the creators of Bookworm, has a blog much better than my blog. And among this, the things that he has here is a word search for State of the Union addresses, which turns out to be quite interesting in terms of uses of publicity. It's not a term that's turned up much in presidential State of the Union addresses. It turns up an awful lot in one president's State of the Union addresses, namely Theodore Roosevelt. Now, if we simply take this, what we seem to have is perhaps this sort of moment when it looks as if the dreams of Kant and Bentham are about to be realized, right? I mean, this is a concerted effort to bring before the public the actions which have been hidden from them. But of course, then something happens. And at that point, we need to turn, if we turn from the history of political thought, to work being done by historians of public relations. And there are such people, but they're all in communication departments. We find a rather different account of the history of publicity. And their account of the history of publicity begins right about during this period that those of us who work in the history of political thought are sort of, we're just waiting to get to Rawls. What they're finding is the birth of their discipline, and it's these names. The only name before this semester that I was at all familiar with was Edward Bernays, who is probably famous in the history for the history of public relations largely because of his incredible efforts at self-promotion and persuading individuals that he was indeed the founder of the field. It also helped that he was Freud's nephew. Probably of more significance, maybe George Creel, who was the director of the U.S. Commission on Public Information during World War I, and then, like many of these people, made a shift from the public arena into the private arena, and then begins providing the same services which he's been providing to the U.S. government to major corporations. And then finally, the man in the middle, who, as I look there, it looks like a non-orange John Boehner. Was Ivy Lee, had provided services to John D. Rockefeller at the time of the Ludlow massacre to try to make certain of Rockefeller's corporations look better. Lee has a little book called Publicity, Some of the Things It Is and Is Not, which is published in 1925. Casts some light on changing patterns of usage, where he talks about publicity now for him designates, quote, everything involved in the expression of an idea or an institution, including the policy of the idea or the idea expressed. So everything, and as he's understanding, it includes not just what is said about a client, but more important, what a client does and what a corporation does. And here he's very emphatic that what corporations need to do is establish relationships with their customers, and so we can see the sort of birth here, perhaps, of all of those annoying evaluations we have to fill out after you have any interaction with an internet, a corporation on the internet, where you've bought something and you have to say, well, do you love our website? Do you, I usually say, no, I don't, and then they have to me explain why I don't, why I'm not passionate about their products. Say, well, you don't get, there's no space to say I'm not passionate about machines or inanimate objects. So following Lee's advice, it might make sense to look not so much at what is being said about the concept of publicity, but instead looking what's being done with it. And here, I think, once again, we can take a look at what the Ngram tells us. You can do wildcard searches. They now baked this into about a year or so ago, a couple of years, maybe a year and a half ago or so, into the Ngram. So you can search for what the next noun is that follows publicity, and then does it have a noun after it. And I think what's striking here is that in this massive and indiscriminate corpus that Google has scanned, and in some sense the incoherence of their scanning policy is perhaps a virtue here to us, because this is sweeping up just massive amounts of stuff, right? But it is striking that before, 1900, we don't seem to have publicity followed by nouns. But then we suddenly get all these nouns here. Were we on the actual site, which I'm not going to go to yet, you can just do this, and you can then drag the cursor up and down and highlight different ones and watch how these work. But we begin to see how it initially becomes linked to terms like publicity campaign, publicity work. Publicity campaign remains, just continues to accelerate into the present. It is then followed by terms like publicity man, which peaks probably around between 1930 and 1950, and then is replaced by something else. I suspect that one of the things that's coming in here is ad man, and drawing off some of this. Publicity agent, publicity department, publicity director. And lost in the crowd here, it's a slow riser here, is publicity stunt, which eventually gets up into second place. So you can get a sense that there's some sort of contestation then about what publicity is doing. We have people who are doing publicity, right, and are part of publicity campaigns, and there are other people who are writing about these things and describing them not as campaigns, but as stunts, right? So there's a tension here. Same concept, but being viewed perhaps in certain different ways. All of these activities that are associated with publicity campaigns, departments, directors, and so on, are part of, I think, a shift that's taking place here, where we had, really going back to 1800, a way of talking about publicity in which things were being publicized. We were publicizing things. We were making, the verb for making things public, and making public or to be made public. But then we shift over. I'm sorry, I misstated there. We shift over to talking. This is suggesting to us that we now have a new word for this coming in around 1920. We publicize things. We are publicizing. Not publishing, but publicizing. And this then becomes this other way of talking about what takes place within publicity. Now, for much of the 19th century, the dominant metaphor that's being used, to wrap up here, for publicity involves images of light. That things are being brought into the light of publicity. And this, of course, perhaps speaks to the, shall we say, Enlightenment origins of the sense of the concept which is being used in Kant and Bentham. That publicity is, after all, one of the pet projects of the period we have come to call the Enlightenment. As a couple of historians of journalism, Kevin Stoker and Brad Rollins pointed out in a 2005 article, towards the end of the 19th century, something seems to happen with how people talk about light, and it stops being as they describe it. And this isn't so much how people actually describe it, because they're using their own metaphor here. Where there was once if you like, a spotlight of publicity being shined on things. You find at the end of the 19th century lots of complaints about the fetish of publicity, or the passion for publicity, or the craze for publicity. Books with these titles begin to appear, as if there's a sense here that there's just too much publicity. So things are entering into the public light which should not enter into the public light. The other thing that seems to be happening then is also a shift in how the light is being generated. And they try to capture this in terms of talking about a spotlight of publicity which have been shined on objects, which is how the progressive era is talking about this, of shining this light into dark corridors. Instead, the metaphor then, as they see it, becomes more like flashlight, a flashlight of publicity, where once Creel and others have left the government to work for particular firms, they are shining the light of publicity on those particular attributes of the firm that they want to have visible. Stoker and Rollins were doing this before the arrival of Google and Bookworm, and as a result, they miss, because how could they not help but miss it, because this is not stuff you can really think up on your own. a rather subtle shift in metaphors that takes place. If we do a search for, in place of light of publicity, all the, what words have appeared before publicity, of publicity, we get something that's completely unreadable. If you look at it that way, and this is where I hope we can shift. Great. James Schmidt does not really want your feedback. He doesn't want you to read that either. What he wants to do is just get to his blog so we can go together, by increments through how the word publicity works, how of publicity is working here. So we're starting out here, if we look at, with degree of publicity being high. And what Google does here is they just grab the top 10 for any period. So when you look at these, when you're doing these sort of wildcard searches, it makes sense to proceed by small increments because they're going to turn up different words depending upon where you are on this. And if you're just pulling it all back from say, the present, you're only going to get the top 10 words in 2000 rather than what certain things that have dropped off along the way. But if you look here, I mean, don't even need to look at the charts here, just some of the words that are there. It's degree of publicity, light of publicity, means of publicity, kind of publicity, a principle of publicity, matter of publicity, system of publicity. I mean, these are all, it seems to me, recognizable terms from the world of still surviving from the world of Bentham and legal discussions of publicity. If we extend it a little bit forward in 1920, we begin to see a different set, right? And you look what's beginning to battle for first place there is campaign of publicity and light of publicity. We still have some of these other terms. And then we begin to pick up down here, the glare of publicity begins to come into its ascent. This other metaphor of light, where publicity is not just simply something, it's a quality of this light, that it's not simply illuminating, it's dazzling us, it's attacking us, it's has a certain unpleasant characteristics. If we go to down to 1970, we begin to find glare of publicity in the ascent into second place. The two, glare of publicity and light of publicity, cross, I think, somewhere around 1950s, I think, is going there. Towards the end of the 1950s is the moment when these two begin to cross, and we have more glare and less light. Finally, just to bring us up to the present, we find a rather strange interloper coming in. And blasting through all else. We now have a right of publicity. And it might for a moment there look as if suddenly all the hopes of the progressive era were being realized, and that citizens indeed had a right to know where campaign funds were coming from, or had a right to see what sorts of dealings their legislators were engaged in, their representatives were engaged in. Sadly, that's not what the right of publicity seems to mean. What the right of publicity involves is the right of certain individuals who are famous and their heirs to have control over their persona in legal dealings. In other words, it's a right to exploit the commercial value of personal identity. It is the right of celebrities to be able to cash in that famousness that they've managed to accumulate and make money off of it. Since the number of famous dead celebrities now vastly outnumbers the number of famous living ones, this right is sometimes entrusted by their heirs to various agencies, all of whom seem to be conveniently located in states, since this is largely a matter of state law of publicity rights, in states that have laws which have obviously the most aggressive policies about what protects the rights of publicities. This commodification of personal identity is probably not the greatest threat facing those of us who might seek to illuminate the dark dealings that pass for politics in the oligarchy that now governs us, but is of a piece with a world where everything seems to be for sale and anything can step forward in the guise of a commodity. That world was a world that probably would not have surprised the co-authors of the book that deeply inspired Habermas's Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit. They were Horkheimer and Adorno, who wrote a little book called Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I think probably Habermas might have been better to have picked, instead of Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit, a much more, I think, faithful title to the book that he published might have been Dialectik der Aufklärung, which at least suggests that maybe when we finally get a new translation of structural transformation of the public sphere, which I think we really desperately need. I mean, this is just a disaster of a translation. Perhaps they would have the courage to translate it as a dialectic of publicity.
So first of all, thanks to our speakers for 2 terrific papers. Adi, how long do we have for discussion? Sorry, did we go till 11:15? Okay, thank you.
Half an hour.
So we have half an hour, so the floor is open. Yes, Elias.
Thank you very much for the 2 wonderful talks. I have a question that relates to both, actually, and I'll start with the publicity angle, which it seems to me that once the engram viewer once we're years down the road, and the engram viewer is taking into account online publications as well, we're going to see a rapid spike in the use of a word that relates to what Professor Schmidt's talking about, that is the word viral, which is becoming, it seems to me, the word that we use to talk about massive publicity of a fact in the public sphere. We can say that an idea or a video or a concept has gone viral. And this, I think, also relates to the idea of non-sovereign agency. It almost suggests that things become widely known as a result of just widespread dissemination, precisely not because one person or one organization is trying to publicize it, but through the structural, systemic dynamics of a large population being interested in something and disseminating it through this kind of non-sovereign, through the non-sovereign agential act of a system rather than individual people. So I wonder if that's a way to get at the contemporary understanding, or one of the contemporary understandings of publicity in the post-print age.
Well, yeah, you are. Go on. Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, that does tie things together very nice, doesn't it? Because I mean, that I suppose language has non-sovereign. I guess language would be an example of something that has non-sovereign agency over us, right? As you know, we find when we're constantly battling the barbarisms that we find in student papers. My bête noire is impactful. Or impacted, or at a certain point I realized that my students were turning in papers in which they never explained the relationship with one thing and another. They said something was impacted by something else. And I've tried very hard to explain that, that there are other ways and more subtle ways of talking about things. And then I sometimes say, well, when I hear the word impacted, I think about impacted fecal matter or stuff like that. That doesn't work either. But then we find the same language in, at least I do, in the memos that come down from the administration of my university. We talk about impactful research. So, I mean, it's a losing battle.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really interesting point. And what it makes me think about is how the material fields that are part of constituting agency include not just what we think of as nature out there, but also include the built environment and environment. And I think the kind of material dynamics of information systems that you're talking about bring together the material and the social dimensions of uptake for agency in very interesting ways, and in ways that also are going to manifest systematic inequalities and so on, and so they can both bring agency to fruition in ways that seem like outlandishly, wildly successful, but at the same time, because what's available to be received and what people are willing to receive in viral ways also depends on backgrounds of social meaning and interpretation, and which include things like stigma and stereotype. That those viruses are both a measure of how non-sovereign agency can spread beyond our wildest expectations, but also the ways it can simultaneously replicate or continue to embody inequalities that undercut agency in important ways for certain.
Okay, I have 3 people waiting, Bonnie, Alex, and then Suzanne. Just signal me if you want to get on the queue. Okay, Bonnie.
Okay. So, well, my first observation about your papers together is just that both of them have sort of originally political...
Bonnie, can you use the mic?
Sorry. My first observation about the papers together is that both of the concepts have originally political valences that have become more commercial. So I was thinking about what you talked about, publicness to publicity, but also agency. I think most people would think of an advertising agency as the proper place to talk about agency outside of the small little world of political theory. So it just sort of struck me. But Sharon, my question is mostly for you. I thought that was a really fabulous paper. But I have this question, because it seemed to me that although you talked really wonderfully about agency and the different sort of ways of thinking about it and the stakes in so doing, you kept coming back to the question of accountability. And so this question is a real question, not like, why didn't you do it this other way, but why not rethink accountability rather than rethinking agency? Not because I didn't like what you did with agency, not at all. But I'm just wondering if there's a way. It seems to me that presupposed by what you did do is the idea that we need agency of some sort to have accountability, and that might be right. So the question, though, is it possible to think about accountability in a way that doesn't postulate agency? Are there other ways of thinking, just like you looking at other ways of thinking about agency, are there other ways of thinking about accountability? And you gave us a little bit of some reasons for thinking of that, I thought, in what you did say. So in Bernard Williams, that great quote of his, that there's an authority to what one has done and not just to what one intended, I think he's saying that because certain things can't be undone, not because we can't take them back in the world, but because they happen through us. And so we're altered by our having done them, even in an unintentional way. And for that reason, he spends a lot of time talking about the moral salience of regret, because that's the healing balm for that, right? And in Arendt, and you didn't talk about this, which is totally fine, but that whole account of dispersed agency that she risks comes with the importance, the political necessity of forgiveness, right? Which is also a kind of balm or softening agent of some kind that allows us to kind of keep agency, but also in a kind of relaxed way. And those both have to do with accountability. We relax accountability to the regretful wrongdoer. Sometimes forgiveness itself postulates accountability, right? You're accountable for something, and our response is not to punish, but to forgive. Those are both ways of resuturing agency in its communal form also, right? Because in the act of forgiveness, we have a kind of binding. So, but they come, seems to me, more out of making the dog accountability and the tail agency, rather than what you were doing in this version of your argument, where agency is the focus and accountability is sort of the underlying thing. So I'm just wondering what you have to say about that choice, what it might look like if you flipped it, why you wouldn't want to flip it. So,
should I take the? Thanks. That's great. And actually, in the process of writing this, I realized that accountability was kind of coming to the center of the stage. And one of the reasons why I found it coming to the center of the stage is that in thinking about agency with people who are who are thinking about agency in the context of the sorts of ecological questions and problems that I'm interested in right now, people like Bennett and others are Rosie Braidatis, people who are kind of thinking in post-humanist ways, or Derrida for that matter, the animal I am, animal that therefore I am. It seems like over and over again, people who are trying to think about agency in what I think of as non-sovereign ways come to a point where they say, of course, everything I've said about agency throws ethical life into jeopardy and makes it, very difficult to see how we could hold anybody accountable for anything, which of course is an important thing to be able to do if we care about politics and living decently. So, but then I haven't yet found any way. And if people have suggestions for this, I would be grateful to have them. But I haven't yet found anybody who's kind of adopting a post-humanist kind of approach that has anything satisfying to say about the accountability thing. So I think maybe the way that accountability comes in to kind of dominate this paper is a function of that, like me just trying to figure out what am I starting to think about that? Actually, in writing this, I also realized there is so much more to say. So it was actually helpful for me in terms of thinking about where to go next with this project. And I don't know.
Accountability at the next concepts conference, if you want.
Okay, great. That would be perfect. But Arendt on forgiveness. Williams on regret, I don't know. I think forgiveness in Arendt, at least, is just, I think, deeply unsatisfying. It's not nearly enough. Non-sovereign agency means that the non-sovereignty of agency means that we need to, in some ways, relax our standards or conception of accountability, but in some ways it means we need to radically expand that. And to understand and to accept that we are actually accountable, that we need to make changes and not just ask for forgiveness, that we need to, and not just change ourselves, but change the world so that our initiatives can find the kind of uptake that makes for justice rather than injustice and, ecological destruction and so on.
Suzanne? Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Alex is next. I'm sorry.
Speaking of justice, here we go.
My agency was depending. No, I'm just kidding.
I was getting ahead. I already
I've been silenced.
really bad.
Recovery of my agency here is. So I have sort of separate questions for Sharon and for James. For Sharon, this sort of builds off of this discussion, but you said that you were excluding collective agency at the beginning, but I wonder what happens when we bring it back. For a couple reasons. For one thing, collective agency might be the kind of solution to some of the problems you're talking about, and might be the only site for the solution of some of these problems that you're talking about: structural injustice, large-scale social, environmental problems, precisely because there isn't anything you can do at the individual level, and demands for individual sensitivity or forgiveness or things like that are just sort of recipes for feeling self-righteous in the midst of helplessness, so whereas collective agent. But that then does raise the question, how much of your critique of sovereign agency is a critique of individual agency or of agency itself? Because it seems like a lot of the kinds of powerless or inability to control certain effects that you discussed are true of individual agents, but might not be true of sovereign agents, namely collective agents, the state or something. The state can pass laws that can fundamentally redistribute resources, create all kinds of opportunities that really transform those social processes that we end up being a part of when we act. And we can't make those changes as individuals. So what happens, in which case, some of the problems that you discuss might be problems that are much more true of individual agency than agency itself. because there are things one can do as collective agents. There are kinds of control we can exercise as collective agents and maybe can only exercise as collective agents. So that's sort of a half suggestion, half question about what you think of that. And for James, I was wondering if you could say what you think the dialectic of publicity is, because I love both of these presentations were really stimulating and interesting, and I loved sort of the data you were giving, but is the dialectic of publicity the subversion of the public sphere? There is a moment in which the idea of publicity really is the idea that power can be controlled by reason, but then over time, in fact, reason itself is subverted for the interests of power? Or is it the idea that public opinion just turns out to be itself a form of power that can be manipulated by the powerful? So the reason we end up with propaganda, people like Creel, and then ad campaigns is that it turns out that public opinion, and therefore publicity, is just easily manipulated. All the 20th century pamphlets about public opinion are things like Walter Lippmann's. It's the domain of the irrational, not the rational. And it's easy to manipulate. So it's just a new form of power that can be exercised by the powerful. Is that the dialectic of it? Or that it never really was the domain of reason in the first place? Or it was the domain of reason that then, as it became more powerful, just became a new site of power that could be manipulated? So I sort of was curious to know what you thought that dialectic actually was.
Thanks, Alex. I haven't thought a lot about collective agency, but my sense is that you're right to say that many of the issues, the problems that I've identified as being, are problems that can only be solved through collective action. I think that's right. But whether collective agents are more sovereign in the sense I'm using the word than individuals, that I'm not so sure about. Because I mean, think about, states can pass laws, but if there's no uptake for those laws, if people don't actually obey them, it means nothing. Physical force, the monopoly on force means something that's real, and a real, resource for generating the uptake, the kind of social uptake in the population that makes the agency of the state, brings it to fruition in our sense. But still, that the fact that states have the kind of resources to kind of foster the coming to fruition of their own agency, does that make agency sovereign, or does that just show that they have the resources to bring their agency to fruition? Because the second thing still allows for the idea that their agency isn't something that's internal to the state itself, but is distributed in the way that I've described. So, and it's not just the population of the state that's needed to kind of bring about the social uptake, but it's also the behavior of other states, what states can do. Depends a lot on the responses of other states and non-governmental, other sorts of actors in the political domain, on economies, on the material world. So I don't know. I mean, I think this is another kind of important next step for me with my project to think about the relationship between individual and collective agency vis-a-vis non-sovereignty. But I'm skeptical that I'm skeptical about collective agents having the kind of sovereignty that individual agents lack. But I could turn out to be wrong.
Yeah, well, in the dialectic of publicity business, I suppose all I'm looking for is some sort of formulation that would do the same thing for publicity that Horkheimer and Adorno do with myth is already enlightenment, but enlightenment lapses back into myth. I mean, you have unstable concepts that one thought were dichotomous, but in fact they're mutually implicit in each other. So I suppose it would be some sort of tracing the way in which a concept that was seen as political publicity lapses into commercial publicity, but then in some sense from the very start, commercial publicity was political. So to try to, try to maybe break down some of the barriers that would separate what's a certifiably political concept from various other concepts that may look like they lie outside the ambit of politics, but in fact are political. Which in terms of the context of forgiveness in Arendt, I was thinking, one way of thinking about that might be that it does seem that, first of all, it is tied very closely to the category of action. I don't think you can disengage what she says about forgiveness from action. And secondly, I suppose that her what's always sort of baffling about the discussion is that the thinker who is the major thinker of forgiveness, I mean, the principal philosopher of forgiveness in Arendt is Jesus of Nazareth. And someone who's not normally thought of as a political thinker, and then what you do with that is, you're right, is either unsatisfying, baffling, or intriguing, depending upon which day of the week it is. But I guess it's just a question about whether there are political concepts that inhabit a universe different than other concepts.
Okay, Suzanne.
Okay, so, my question, I think, is quite similar to Alex's, and Sharon, this is for you first. You're working with this responsive or self-reflexive or distributive notion of agency, and I do have a question about whether the issue is individual agency, agency on its own as a concept, right, separate from that, collective agency. And so from what you were saying, I had a sense that you want to argue that there's something in agency that is excessive or in excess of, you say the individual, I prefer the subject, right? But I think one could also reverse it. There is something in the subject, there's an excess of agency. And that therefore these two notions, agency and the subject, exist in a continuously displacing relationship to each other. And so I was just going to ask you to maybe reflect a little bit about how you would think about these two terms together. Okay? And maybe since I'm on a question about excess, James, how would you think about the idea of too much publicity? What would that look like, and what would that mean? Because I'm wondering whether that's related to this idea of the dialectic.
Okay, so I agree with what I hear you saying, that agency and the subject, or agency and subjectivity, or the subject, are not synonymous. They're not the same things.
That's exactly what you want to argue.
Yes, and you make a very interesting point, which I agree with, that it's not just that there's more to agency than the subject, but it's also true that there's more to the subject than agency. We're not, that we are things beyond, other than agents. That's for sure. And I'm not sure where to go with that. Do you have a sense of where you want to push that?
Well, I'm wondering, I guess, to come back to Alex's comment, whether it has to do with structures, away from the individual to maybe structures of subject positions that are only or necessarily exist in terms of broader social structures. Right? In other words, where these categories become much more difficult to distinguish as entities, but are in fact in some kind of structure of mutual support, but also undoing.
So you're suggesting that maybe. So are you suggesting that maybe agency, even in the non-sovereign way that I've kind of described it, agency doesn't exist? That what exists are structures that shape and elicit certain kinds of responses or actions from
Get marked as agentic
agentic.
or not.
which would be a kind of fully deterministic world? I mean, would that be deterministic or? I mean, it just seems to me that that there are enough instances when we look at social and political life of both individuals and groups, you know, generating action, erupting in forms of activity that resist or fail to track what we see as the dominant, you know, structures that ought to be constraining their action or shaping their action. That there's just, I don't know, it seems to me that unless we're completely misreading those actions, which I guess is possible, it just seems to me that there are enough instances of resistance to power to doubt that power or structures of oppression and domination are fully determinative.
I mean, I would totally agree with the first, I would agree actually with what you're saying. I hesitate about saying, oh yeah, I'm just going to say it's all determined because that's not the position I would take, but I don't think that the other side of that is that the space for agency, I guess. You see what I mean? In other words, I don't think that agency is that place that is not being determined.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, to some degree, what is that space? What's a better word for marking that space or that kind of experience that we have or that we think we have, that we experience ourselves as having and that we seem to observe in other people for, you know, as being sources of activity that have an impact on the world, that don't track what an understanding of the dominant structures of power in any particular context would lead you to expect of them. To me, that's, you know, agency is one useful, it's useful in part for marking that experience. And is that experience a kind of like perfectly spontaneous in the sense that it's not, you know, shaped or affected by anything? Of course not, definitely not. But, you know.
Yeah, well, help.
Yeah, so I guess too much, quote unquote, too much publicity. I mean, I guess it would be significant that that Bentham, the author of these proposals for the Public Opinion Tribunal, is of course also the author of the Panopticon. So there would be some type of assumption that there's a distinction between things which are not public and are at best voluntarily publicizable, which become public without one's agreement. And certainly one of the many, I suppose, problematic, shall we say, but perhaps insightful arguments in the human inerrant is the destruction of what would look at one point to be a clear distinction between public and private by the rise of the social. And certainly, given the sorts of technologies we now have, there's very little that we do that is not at least potentially publicizable by those who want to make profits off it. Amazon still wants me to buy a certain type of saw that I once looked at. And that this has been, you know, and they still think I'm interested in this.
Okay, next I have Mark, then Paul. Nathaniel, did you signal me back then? Okay, and then you're after that. Okay, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for these talks. Sharon, I had a question. I really enjoyed your paper, and I agree with most of it. Maybe I agree with all of it, but I wanted to ask you the question whether, I guess this is really just to push you to talk a little bit more about sovereignty, and to ask, I guess, provocatively, whether simply to decide that you're going to strike out sovereignty with a non is not, as it were, a kind of sovereign gesture, ironically speaking. And the reason why I'm asking that is not just to, do a little clever bend, but to ask how you would talk about sovereign effects in the world, policing, government by crisis, various ways in which the public sphere has been eroded by modes of sovereign effects within governmentality, as it were, as people like Judith Butler and others have written about. I would agree that sovereignty has to be rethought as, in a certain way, fractured, an illusion in a certain sense, but it's nonetheless, if you're thinking of sovereignty as it were, the punctual origin of power effects, it seems to be a concept that one doesn't simply want to legislate out of existence without having accounted for how these effects work. Does that make any sense? That's my question to you.
It does, and I appreciate it. And I'm using the language of non-sovereignty to describe these socially, materially distributed dimensions of agency, for lack of a better word. It's kind of cumbersome language. And you make the point, which is a very important one that I hadn't really thought about, but the degree to which moving away from the language of sovereignty could turn our attention away from the ways that this thing we call sovereignty does in reality operate as in terms of sites of concentrated power that have important effects on people's lives. I wouldn't want the effort to think about agency in non-sovereign ways have that. I wouldn't want it to have that effect. So that's, but. And then this comes back in a way to Alex's question and Suzanne's question about sovereignty in the context of collective agents like states. If states are collective agents, I just haven't thought enough about what collective agency means to say much about that. But I don't know, why not just talk about concentrated sites of power, or sites of concentrated power, which include states for sure, police forces and so on, but also corporations, companies that rape the earth, and exploit people's labor. So I don't know, I guess I'm reluctant to kind of think about or name the state as this unique, special source or site of something called sovereignty that really has sovereignty in the way that I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
If I could just what I was really thinking of were Agamben kinds of emphasis on loci of deciding on the exception that are actually not simply the state, but rather camp policing, distributed effects of sovereignty that don't simply go back to one single sovereign state in that sense. They don't go back to a sovereign, but there are effects of sovereignty. I find that a very powerful analysis, actually.
There are effects of sovereignty, but it seems to me that there are also, the effects of how what we think of as the sovereign authority of the state or the police force or whatever is received, how those actions are received by people, not just the people who are victims of them, but the broader public. So, why do, the kind of power that's exercised over young black men by police forces is a power that's supported, sustained the sovereignty of the police officer in a particular encounter is a sovereignty that's sustained by the broader social context in which Black lives don't matter the way that white lives matter. And so in that sense, I think that the sovereignty of the state in that kind of an encounter is as much distributed as the sovereignty of the individual who's trying to make something happen in the world is distributed. And with both the sometimes unintended potency that implies and the vulnerability that it implies. I mean, if people really did, broadly resist this behavior and say, by police officers, and say, really, it's not actually okay, we will not tolerate it, then the authority that the police officer has in those encounters would be much different. And, okay.
Okay, let's try to work in, if we can, 2 more questions, maybe? Do you think?
I'll give up, so.
What? A little bit of time? Paul, and then Nathaniel, and then I think we really have to stop. Yeah, okay.
I had a question for Sharon, but I'll precede that with a comment on this last interchange. Just before Mark's second comment, you expressed some discomfort with your use of the term sovereignty for what you were actually talking about, and I think the exchange illustrated why, because we ended up talking about sovereignty in a very political sense, of legitimate source of authority or something like that, but your larger argument was against essentially a radical conception of human autonomy. And what you were criticizing is essentially a concept that we can form in parallel with the concept of radical evil, namely a conception of radical freedom, that you're free all the way down no matter what your past history has been, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's certainly, what the main thing I thought that you were totally reasonably attacking. Anyway, that's the comment. The question is the following. I agreed with a great deal of your argument. I'm wondering how helpful it actually is to speak of the effects of the material world and even some of the effects of other human beings on the actions of an individual as constitutive of their agency, rather than as setting the conditions in which the agency is exercised. And it seems to me that the latter way of putting it, which I think you actually used at one point in one of your answers, puts a little more separation between let's just take the case of individual agency, a little more separation between what the individual is trying to do and what the rest of the world is essentially going to do with what the individual is trying to do. And in particular, it allows, I think, it allows us to be able to say kind of clearly what one of the real problems is, namely that we're exercising our agency in conditions of epistemic imperfection. We don't know all the factors that are going to affect how it is what we're trying to do turns out. And we ought to be particularly humble about our exercise of our own agency, given the fact that we're always, to a greater or lesser degree, working in the dark. And when you talk about conditions in which agency is exercised, or something like this, circumstances in which it's exercised, rather than speaking of all these things as actually constitutive of the agency, you have room for precisely the epistemic gap in which agency is actually typically exercised. And I wonder if you find that helpful.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I've been pushed on this before. Isn't it just about conditions on agency, not the constitution of agency? And really nobody, I think virtually nobody would disagree with the idea that agency is conditioned by social and material factors, but a lot of people disagree with the idea that agency is constituted in part by social and material factors. And I think I do want to defend the second view, because I think the first way of thinking about it, in the end, collapses agency into what happens inside the heads of individuals, namely willing, the activity of willing. And it just seems to me that if we accept that agency is about more than just willing, but actually acting, having an impact on the world, doing things, then agency is no longer going to be located solely inside the individual, but it's going to have this more distributed quality where other things outside the individual are part of actually constituting the agency, not just conditioning, something that already exists independently.
If a very quick follow-up, I don't think, speaking of conditioning forces, you get into that, let's call it Cartesian view of agency, which kind of nobody in their right mind is really going to buy. But there might still be a value in, I mean, there's something to what you're saying, and I think there's something to what I'm saying. Namely, there are various ways in which all kinds of interactions with other people and your whole history of interactions with other people enters into your conceptions of what you could try to do and what you should try to do, and so on and so forth. And in that way, it is constitutive of your agency. On the other hand, there's all kinds of ways in which the external world, including other people and so on, and aspects of it that aren't really currently very well understood by you, will affect the outcome of what you try to do. And those two things I think are in some way worth distinguishing.
Yes, and I don't want to suggest that there's no role for something individuated in individual agency, because I think there is. The initiative moment of agency is an individual moment.
Okay, we're really going to need to carve out a break here. So, Nathaniel, could you just ask your question, and then we won't actually hear the answers.
Well, my question will be unanswerable. So.
Okay. I just fear we'll lose our break, but I want to hear it.
It's like Charles Ives.
There you go. So anyway, the talks were amazing, both gripping in really different ways. And my question is mainly to Sharon, but it very much brings in the concerns that James raised as well. And I was going to ask a different question at the beginning when I raised my hand, but this last exchange, maybe it's a good that I came at the end here. So I think one of the great models for non-sovereign agency is giving a talk, right? I mean, it is the model. It's the thing we all have most experience with. If you give a talk and you intend one thing, and then people interpret it in 1,000 different ways. We were actually talking about this morning. And you have no idea how it's going to affect you. You do your best and you try it and all that. And so I guess my question really is something of a reception of how your talk sounded to me personally. And it's something of an aesthetic question, I guess. I found that in the talk there's a real, those moments when you bring in what obviously is moving you, your ethical imperatives, there's this moment of clarity, of light, right? You say, the corporate rape of the earth, or Black Lives Matter and police violence, and it aesthetically, it's at such odds with the complicated, impactful, or inward turn thing of agency but and that, and but on the other hand, and the moral but on the other hand. And it's that disparity, I think, I don't think it's a flaw, I think that is the problem, right? And between this moral clarity and then the recognition of the complicated conditions under which one might possibly respond. And there's something I basically wanted to put that on the table of even talking about this and that aesthetic disjuncture between these two, what I think of as two dimensions of your talk. Because when you were talking, I was thinking, well, why retain the concept? And I think that underlines a lot of something of other people's. Why retain this concept when we've critiqued it 9 ways to Sunday? When we've situated 9 ways to Sunday, when we know it has the Cartesian resonance, and part of me was saying, well, is this some kind of bad faith thing going on here? You're retaining this concept after you completely undermined it, and then say, yes, but agency, but agency, but agency. But it's not a question of bad faith, it's something else. And so I wanted to propose 2 possible things, or 2 ways in which it affected me. One was tragedy, and it's in a very modern sense of tragedy, right? And you evoked Oedipus in the beginning, and we could read Oedipus in its Greek way, or it's in its modern Freudian way. But there's a real tragic sense in your talk. At least that's how it affects me. Maybe it's my mood this morning, of people acting in a way in which they don't know what they're doing, and they're being undermined, or that they're groping around in the dark. Maybe it's sort of very modern tragedy of feeling like you could change the world, and yet knowing that in the end our actions are, the meaning of our actions are constantly escaping us and all that. And the name that pops into my mind is Sartre, just that feeling of condemned to be free, knowing all the time that the meanings are escaping our control, and in a social context, in every conceivable context that has been put on the table. And then the last thing I want to say, which hooks up to the invocation of that other philosopher, that little-known philosopher that James evoked, that it's really, the concept of non-sovereign agency is a religious concept. That's how it resonates to me. Non-sovereign agency, it's almost the definition of the religious subject, right? Someone who's acting but knows that ultimately his or her actions are, not his or her own, and will be judged by in some way that they're not sovereign. The giving up of sovereignty, right? Or the seizing by the subject of sovereignty was the movement of secularization. And the movement towards non-sovereign agency, it is perhaps a secularized version of the religious subject. And I think it's not an accident, for example, that at least to me, Sartre's whole oeuvre could be viewed as and very, quite explicitly in many places, a sort of a secularization of that religious idea of, he doesn't use this phrase, of non-sovereign agency. And I wondered how that sat with you. This, again, this distinction between the ethical passion and the knowledge of our weakness, humility, and so on and so forth feels very religious.
Now, that's truly unanswered.
Yes. Well, I'm hoping we can continue this conversation in our very short break. But let's thank our speakers.